He believed his badge was a crown, his uniform a suit of armor, and the court a stage where he could perform without fear of consequence. For years, he walked into those wooden chambers with the arrogance of a man convinced he was above accountability. People bowed to his word. His testimony was rarely questioned. Families swallowed grief in silence because they knew the cost of fighting back was often worse than the injustice itself. But arrogance breeds blindness. When he pulled over Maya, he assumed it would be routine. Another file on his desk. Another case dismissed under his polished boots. He could not have known she was different. She carried within her a quiet strength sharpened by years of serving her community. She wasn't just another teacher, another black woman forced to bow her head. She was the one who would draw back the curtain, exposing not only his cruelty but the machinery of silence that had kept him powerful for so long. The courtroom he thought was his kingdom would become his undoing. And every lie he had hidden behind his badge would finally catch fire. The city seemed ordinary to the casual eye. Rows of brick houses lined the streets. Churches and small grocery stores punctuated neighborhoods where families had lived for generations. Children biked along cracked sidewalks, neighbors nodded politely across fences, and the hum of life gave an illusion of peace. Yet beneath the surface lay a simmering divide. Black residents carried stories etched into memory, stories of traffic stops that escalated, of nights in holding cells without cause, of lives disrupted not by crime but by suspicion. The police force, predominantly white, prided itself on being tough but fair. In reality, fairness bent under the weight of prejudice. Officer Kane thrived in that imbalance. He joined the department young, ambitious, and quickly learned how power could be wielded like a weapon. His reports were always thorough, his arrests always packaged neatly, and his testimony convincing enough to silence most doubt. In a department eager to showcase results, Kane delivered numbers. He became the model officer in the eyes of superiors. But numbers came at a cost. Behind every statistic was a life altered. Young men were forced to drop out of school because of records that should not have existed. Mothers are drained by court fees for crimes never proven. Business owners are harassed into compliance. And through it all, Kane stood tall, his smirk unbroken, because he believed the system would always shield him. Maya's world was far different. She lived in a modest home not far from the school where she taught. Her classroom was more than a place of education, it was a sanctuary. She decorated the walls with affirmations, lined the shelves with books by authors her students could see themselves in, and created an environment where possibility bloomed despite the limitations imposed by society. Her life was not without hardship. She had faced the subtle dismissals of colleagues who underestimated her, endured the weight of being a single black woman in a city that often overlooked voices like hers, and carried the responsibility of being a role model to children who looked to her for hope. Yet Maya's strength lay in her resolve. She believed deeply in justice, not just in theory but in practice, and taught her students the value of truth even when it was uncomfortable. The night her path collided with Kane's was unremarkable at first. She had attended a community event celebrating local student achievements and was driving home, humming softly to the memory of children laughing. The streets were quiet. The glow of streetlights stretched across her windshield. Then came the flash of red and blue lights. Kane approached her car with the same air of dominance he always carried. He accused her of reckless driving, of endangering others, of resisting instructions she had never been given. She responded calmly, respectfully, but his eyes were already set. He wrote charges with a pen as sharp as a blade, convinced she would crumble as so many had before. But Maya did not crumble. She left that night shaken, yes, but also determined. She would not simply pay a fine or accept a record that did not belong to her. She would fight. She owed it to herself, to her students, and to every family that had whispered about men like Kane in hushed tones. She gathered her documents, prepared her statement, and walked into the courthouse with quiet dignity. The people who knew her saw more than a woman defending herself. They saw the beginning of something larger, though they could not yet name it. Kane, on the other hand, entered the courtroom with the same smugness that had carried him for years. To him, Maya was already defeated. He had the badge, the uniform, the years of perceived credibility. But arrogance blinds, and Kane was walking into a storm he could not control. The courtroom smelled faintly of varnish and dust, its benches filled with faces that carried curiosity, skepticism, or silent support. For most, it was another day of routine hearings, but for Maya, it was a battlefield. She stood alone, her presence calm but resolute. From the outset, the cracks began to show. Kane presented his report with the confidence of a man used to winning. Yet small details didn't align. Time stamps conflicted. The dashcam footage he swore proved her recklessness showed only an uneventful drive. The judge frowned, subtly but noticeably. Word spread quickly in the community. Maya is fighting. Neighbors whispered it in grocery store aisles, parents repeated it at school drop-offs, and slowly the courtroom filled more with each session. Reporters began to appear, their pens scratching furiously as they sensed a story that extended beyond a traffic stop. Maya's determination inspired others. Families who had once stayed silent began to share their experiences. One mother spoke quietly of her son, arrested for loitering outside his own apartment building. A business owner described repeated inspections that conveniently aligned with his refusal to offer discounts to officers. None of these stories was part of Maya's case directly, but together they painted a picture that resonated beyond her defense. Community leaders organized. Meetings were held in church basements. Testimonies were gathered. A quiet tide was rising, one Kane had underestimated. He continued to strut into the courtroom, but each day his smirk seemed tighter, his confidence less certain. The badge he wore felt heavier under the weight of scrutiny. As weeks passed, evidence mounted. Old complaints against Kane resurfaced, cases that had mysteriously disappeared from the record. Whispers turned into headlines. Local papers began asking why one officer's word had been treated as gospel despite inconsistencies. The police department issued stiff statements about trust and fairness, but the unease was undeniable. Maya endured moments of fear. She knew challenging authority came with risks. Late at night, she would sit at her desk, papers spread before her, exhaustion tugging at her resolve. She thought of her students, of the little girl who once told her she wanted to be a lawyer, because you said the truth matters. That memory became her fuel. Kane, meanwhile, grew restless. He tried intimidation, stares in the hallway, subtle remarks under his breath, but they only revealed his desperation. For the first time, he was not in control. The system that had coddled him was beginning to pull away. Kane shifted in his seat, his jaw clenched, eyes darting. For the first time, his badge no longer looked like armor. It looked like a shackle dragging him into disgrace. The judge's expression hardened. The gallery sat in stunned silence. Maya remained still, her strength unshaken. She didn't gloat, didn't smile. She simply bore witness as truth unfolded. The climax was not a single explosion but a relentless wave, crashing again and again until Kane's carefully built image was swept away. He had thought himself untouchable. Now he was laid bare. The verdict dismissed the charges against Maya completely. But the impact reached far beyond her freedom. An internal investigation into Kane's conduct was launched. He was stripped of his badge pending review. The community, once silenced, now roared. Families came forward in numbers too great to ignore. National outlets picked up the story, framing Maya as a symbol of courage in the face of systemic abuse. Reforms began slowly but unmistakably. Calls for transparency grew louder. New policies around accountability were introduced. Kane's fall had become a catalyst. For Maya, life returned to her classroom. Her students greeted her with awe, their eyes shining with pride. She reminded them she was still their teacher, still the woman who believed in their worth, but now she carried an added weight, the role of an example. She had shown them that standing firm, even when the odds seemed overwhelming, could ignite change. The city changed too. Not overnight, not completely, but seeds had been planted. The myth of untouchability had been shattered. And the story left behind a lingering question, echoing in hearts far beyond that courtroom. If one woman's courage could unravel years of injustice, what might happen if every silenced voice chose to rise? Anticipation. Kane sat stiffly, his uniform perfectly pressed, but sweat glistened at his temple. Maya sat across from him, composed, her presence a quiet storm. The civil rights lawyer who had been quietly assisting stepped forward. What followed was a presentation that peeled back years of deception. Documents were displayed, complaints long buried unearthed. Patterns of misconduct linked directly to Kane were outlined with chilling clarity. The courtroom gasped as each piece of evidence landed like a hammer. Dates. Names. Reports that contradicted one another. Cases dismissed under suspicious circumstances. The rising action built like a storm. Each session of court was heavier than the last. Each article in the paper drew more attention. The community outside the courthouse swelled, chanting for justice, holding signs, refusing to be silenced. Kane had thought Maya was one woman. He hadn't realized she was a spark that could ignite hundreds. The day of reckoning arrived under gray skies. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters, activists, and families holding photographs of loved ones who had suffered under Kane's authority. The tension was electric, each breath in the courtroom heavy with